This is going to be catastrophic for them. Doug Callahan said it like he was forecasting a hurricane. We were in his law office in Palo Alto, wood paneling, maritime charts on the walls, model ships from our time on the USS Carl Vinson. The place smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. I was 53 years old, sitting across from my former JAG officer, looking at 16 words buried in a vendor contract that could collapse a $50 million company. That's the idea, I said. Doug flipped through the pages again, checked signatures, cross-referenced filing dates, Clause 12.7b. Exclusive licensing reverts upon improper termination of key personnel. He looked up. Gary, this is airtight. Every signature authenticated, every filing current. I know. They'll come after you. Let them. Doug had seen me defuse situations most people didn't know were armed. 30 years ago on the Carl Vinson, I was the systems engineer who kept the lights on when everyone else was panicking. He'd watched me troubleshoot a radar failure during a storm that had captains sweating through their uniforms. But this made him nervous. When does it trigger? He asked. The moment they terminate me without cause, documentation, or legal review. I sipped my coffee. Black, lukewarm. And based on how Trevor's been operating, I'd say we're about 3 weeks out. Here's the thing about Nepo babies. They think a last name is the same as competence. It's not. One opens doors. The other keeps them open. Trevor Ashford was 31 years old. Stanford MBA, 3 years at McKinsey. His father, Richard, owned Apex Systems, and Trevor had ridden that name straight from analyst to VP of strategic initiatives in 18 months. Zero operational experience, zero technical background. But he had opinions. Lots of them. Doug printed one copy of the clause. Just one. Slide it into a fireproof folder with my name on the tab. You built their entire infrastructure through your LLC. 6 years of invoices. Every integration documented. And they signed off on this licensing agreement. Rubber stamped it during vendor consolidation. Corporate lawyers never asked why a VP of operations had an outside LLC. I set down my coffee. Nobody connects dots anymore. They just check boxes. Legally, you're bulletproof, Doug said. Morally, you're giving them exactly what they deserve. He almost smiled. You always were the quiet one. The quiet ones build the walls everyone else stands on. 3 weeks later, Trevor knocked down the wall without checking if it was load-bearing. Let me back up. The firing happened on a Thursday morning. Quarterly strategy meeting. 20 people in the conference room, including every senior leader at Apex Systems. Trevor walked in carrying a folder. I knew what was coming the moment I saw his face. That Stanford smirk he wore when he thought he was being clever. Before we start, Trevor said, I have an announcement regarding organizational restructuring. Organizational restructuring. That's corporate speak for someone's getting fired, and we're going to pretend it's strategic. He opened the folder, pulled out a company hoodie with my name misspelled on the tag, Garrett instead of Garrett. Inside was a $50 Starbucks card. Gary Holloway has been with Apex for 28 years, Trevor said, reading from a script someone else wrote. Probably his father, but due to cultural misalignment and our shift toward more agile leadership paradigms, we've decided to part ways. Cultural misalignment. Agile leadership paradigms. Translation, you're too old and we want you gone. We appreciate Gary's contributions, Trevor continued, but it's time for fresh thinking. Fresh thinking. From a guy who'd been at the company for 18 months and still didn't know how our back-end systems worked. I sat there, hands folded. Watched Trevor hand me the folder like he was presenting an award. The room went quiet. 20 heads swiveling in slow motion. The CFO studied his laptop screen like it might save him. The vice president of sales suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. The only person who didn't flinch was Richard Ashford, Trevor's father, sitting at the head of the table with the expression of a man who'd checked out years ago. Do I need to sign anything today? I asked. Trevor blinked. He'd expected a scene. Maybe anger, something he could use later to justify this. Number. HR will send the exit packet by end of week. Then I'll have my attorney review it. His head snapped up. It's standard termination paperwork, Gary. Pretty straightforward. I'm sure it is. I kept my voice flat. Professional. The same tone that used to make junior sailors check their work twice. I'll have him look at it anyway. I stood up, took the folder, nodded once to the room. Then I walked out. No door slam, no speech. Just the quiet sound of my boots on tile and the hum of the air conditioning trying to cover up 20 people not breathing. Here's what nobody noticed. HR hadn't made me sign anything. No exit acknowledgement. No NDA reminder. No, you agree this termination was legal and fair. Just that folder and a promise of paperwork later. That's because someone in that room knew this wasn't clean. They just didn't know how dirty it really was. I walked past the engineering bay where I'd spent a decade mentoring the team that actually built the product Trevor took credit for in board meetings. Past the break room where someone was cutting a cake for another successful quarter. Past the reception desk where the office manager gave me a look that said, "I'm sorry, but I need this job." Outside, California weather was doing what it always does. Blue sky, light traffic, everything normal. The world doesn't stop because you got fired with a gift card. I got in my truck, 2010 Silverado, 180,000 miles on it. Still ran better than their whole tech stack. Pulled out my personal laptop, the one I never logged into from company Wi-Fi. The one with a very specific file on an encrypted partition. Clause 12-7B trigger. PDF Trevor might have fired me, but I was the one holding the key to the kingdom, and he had no idea what he'd just activated. The clause itself was simple, elegant even. I'd built Apex's entire operational infrastructure over 6 years, not as an employee, but through my LLC. Every integration, every API, every data pipeline, all licensed to the company through Holloway Integrated Solutions. The contract was straightforward, exclusive licensing rights, contingent upon continued employment of key personnel. That key personnel was me. The revocation trigger was equally clear. Improper termination without cause, documentation, or due process. Corporate lawyers had rubber-stamped it during vendor consolidation 18 months ago. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wondered why a VP of operations had an outside LLC. It was filed under routine vendor agreements and forgotten. In the Navy, we called this defensive engineering. Build systems that can't fail. And if someone tries to break them, make sure they break themselves instead. I'd learned that on the Carl Vinson. Systems within systems. Redundancies. Failsafes. The difference was, this failsafe wasn't designed to protect the ship. It was designed to protect me. Doug had asked if it was fair. Fair didn't enter into it. Trevor had spent 18 months systematically erasing my contributions, cutting my budget, reassigning my team, and publicly dismissing my methods as legacy thinking. Legacy thinking. That's what he called 30 years of experience. You know what's funny about consultants? They're great at PowerPoints, terrible at actual operations. Trevor could tell you how to optimize a supply chain. He just couldn't build one. But he had his father's name and an MBA from a school that taught theory instead of reality. So here we were. The clause was my insurance policy, and Trevor had just cashed it in without reading the fine print. I sat in my truck, laptop open, file pulled up on screen. One click would send it to Doug. One certified letter would activate it. But not yet. Let them think they won. Let Trevor celebrate. Let HR send their exit packet with all the standard paperwork they forgot to make me sign in person. Patience is a weapon most people don't know how to use. The Navy taught me that. And Trevor was about to learn it. The vendetta started small. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. Trevor took over as VP of Strategic Initiatives 18 months before he fired me. Before that, he'd been an analyst at McKinsey for 3 years. 0 operational experience. 0 technical knowledge. But he had opinions about how things should work, and his father's ear. Richard Ashford, Trevor's father, founder, and CEO, fast-tracked his son like he was training for the Olympics. Analyst to director to VP in 18 months. Skipped every rung normal people have to climb. You know what's funny about Nepo babies? They think a last name is the same as competence. It's not. One opens doors. The other keeps them open. Trevor never learned the difference. At first he played nice, asked questions, sat in on my team meetings, took notes like he was learning. Then he started making suggestions. Have we considered modernizing this architecture? He'd say in board meetings, loud enough for his father to hear. Never mind that I'd already modernized it twice in 5 years. Never mind that modernizing in Trevor's vocabulary just meant whatever I read about on TechCrunch last week. My budget got cut. Optimization, Trevor called it. My team got reassigned to his projects. Better resource allocation. My monthly ops reports stopped making it onto meeting agendas. My name got removed from key email threads. I'd walk into strategy sessions and find they'd moved the meeting without telling me. When I flagged issues, like the $18,000 coded as innovation lab expenses that turned out to be payments to Trevor's college roommate for strategic consulting, HR told me to focus on positive forward momentum. Positive forward momentum. That's what you say when you don't want to deal with the problem. Trevor's favorite move was the public dismissal. He'd wait until meetings with senior leadership, then drop comments designed to make me look obsolete. That's interesting, Gary, but when did you last take a course in modern systems architecture? Or I think Gary's perspective is rooted in legacy thinking. We need to move fast and break things. Move fast and break things. The rallying cry of every tech bro who's never had to fix what they broke. I didn't fight back. Didn't defend myself in meetings. Just documented everything. Every deleted email. Every budget anomaly. Every meeting I was excluded from. I kept folders, color-coded and time-stamped, backed up to 2 separate cloud drives under project names that meant nothing to anyone but me. I even screen-recorded a video call where Trevor suggested we sunset some of our more tenured staff to make room for digital natives. Digital natives. That's what he called people who grew up with smartphones and thought that made them qualified to run enterprise infrastructure. But I didn't escalate. Not yet, because I knew the sword was coming. This was just confirmation that when it fell, I needed to be ready. 2 months before the firing, I found the smoking gun. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was combing through the Q4 bonus allocation ledger because something didn't add up. We were under budget. Revenue was up, but performance bonuses were short. Way short. I pulled the raw disbursement logs, cross-referenced them against payroll, cross-referenced again against project completion reports. That's when I saw it. A series of transfers labeled Innovation Lab, Team Development. Total amount, $47,500. Recipient, Trevor Ashford. I stared at my screen. Thought maybe this was some kind of coding error, a placeholder that hadn't been updated. But when I pulled the vendor invoice ID, there was nothing in the system. Nothing logged in accounts payable, nothing approved by finance. Just a line item with the fake vendor code and Trevor's personal account on the receiving end. I clicked through the audit log, tracked the approval credentials. Trevor had manually overridden the bonus pool allocation, diverted the funds to himself, and labeled it as team development. In the Navy, we called this stealing. In Silicon Valley, they call it creative resource allocation. I printed the report, not emailed, not saved on company servers. Printed 1 copy, held it under my kitchen light like it was a blueprint. Because that's exactly what it was, a blueprint for what was coming. I didn't call legal, didn't blast an email to the board, didn't post some righteous message on Slack about ethics and accountability. I slipped it into a folder labeled Retirement Fund Insurance and put it on my bookshelf next to my old engineering textbooks. Let it marinate, because I knew what Trevor was building toward. He wanted me gone. The embezzlement just confirmed he was sloppy enough to leave evidence everywhere. And sloppiness is a weapon when you know how to use it. 3 weeks after the firing, my phone rang. Unknown number. Bay Area code. I was on my sailboat sanding teak. Bourbon on the console. The kind of Tuesday afternoon you earn after 28 years of 80-hour weeks. I let it ring twice before answering. This is Gary. Hi, Mr. Holloway. This is Alan Brewster, outside counsel for Apex Systems. His voice had that tight lawyer edge. Nervous, like he was calling someone he didn't want to call. I was hoping we could have an informal conversation about some time-sensitive vendor matters. Informal conversation. Lawyers speak for we're in trouble and need your help, but don't want to admit it. I set down my sandpaper, took a sip of bourbon, let the silence stretch just long enough for him to start breathing funny. I appreciate the call, Alan, but I'm not available for informal anything. I understand. Just thought I'd try. He stumbled over his words. We're in final pitch preparation for our Series B round with Monolith Capital, and certain systems you previously managed have gaps. Gaps. That's a polite way of saying they were drowning and couldn't find the life preservers. I see, I said. Didn't offer solutions. Didn't ask questions. Just let him twist. If you'd consider consulting, even briefly, we'd be happy to compensate. Not interested. But thanks for thinking of me. I hung up. Took another sip of bourbon. Went back to sanding. The teak didn't care about vendor gaps or Series B rounds or Nepo babies learning expensive lessons. It just needed patient work and attention to detail, kind of like building infrastructure that could survive incompetence. That night, I pulled out the manila folder from my filing cabinet. Inside was 1 sheet of paper on my LLC's letterhead. Doug and I had drafted it 3 weeks ago, the day after the firing. Clean, professional, surgical. Title: Formal Notification of Clause Activation, Section 12. 7B. The body was short. Due to termination without cause, review, or formal documentation, this letter serves as official notice that exclusive licensing rights to the following tools, platforms, and back-end integrations have been revoked in accordance with Clause 12. 7B of the signed agreement between Apex Systems Inc. and Holloway Integrated Solutions, LLC. Access is no longer authorized as of the timestamp of this letter's receipt. Attached was a list of every system I'd built, every integration, every API, every data pipeline that made Apex's platform actually work. I slid it into a certified envelope, addressed it to every board member, Richard Ashford included, Malcolm Pierce at Monolith Capital. Then I booked a courier to hand-deliver it first thing in the morning. Not a bomb, a mirror. The kind that shows you exactly what you look like when you fire the person who built your foundation. Doug called that evening. You sent it? Courier delivers tomorrow morning. 8 a.m., they're pitching to Monolith at 10. He paused. Gary, this is going to detonate right before their biggest meeting. I know. Malcolm Pierce is going to see this 2 hours before they ask him for $50 million. I know. Another pause. I could hear Doug pouring something, probably the same bourbon I was drinking. You always were patient, he said. On the Carl Vinson, you'd wait for exactly the right moment to fix a problem. Never rushed, never early. Timing is everything. They're going to panic. They should have thought about that before they fired me without reading the contracts. I took a sip, watched the sun drop toward the water. Besides, this isn't panic. This is consequences. There's a difference? Panic is when something unexpected happens. Consequences are when you do something stupid and reality catches up. Doug laughed. I'm glad I'm not on the other side of this. You taught me well, counselor. The Navy taught you well. I just helped you write it down. We hung up. I sat on my boat, watched the harbor lights come on one by one, listened to the rigging clink against masts in the breeze. Tomorrow morning, Trevor would walk into that boardroom thinking he'd won, thinking he'd successfully removed the legacy thinker who was slowing down his vision. He'd have slides ready, talking points memorized. That Stanford confidence that comes from never actually failing at anything important. And Malcolm Pierce would be sitting there with my letter, reading 16 words that would turn a $50 million pitch into a corporate autopsy. The best part? Trevor still didn't know the clause existed. Nobody had bothered to read the vendor contracts. Nobody had questioned why a vice president of operations had an outside LLC. Nobody had connected the dots between routine vendor agreement and complete infrastructure dependency. You can always tell when a company's in trouble. The nicer the conference room, the worse the fundamentals. And Apex had the nicest conference room in Palo Alto. I finished my bourbon, went below deck, set my alarm for 7:30 a.m., not because I needed to be anywhere, just because I wanted to be awake when the courier delivered the mirror. The courier delivered at 8:07 a.m. I know because I was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from Apex's building, watching through the window. Not because I needed to see it happen. Just because after 28 years I figured I'd earned the right to watch the fuse get lit. The courier, young guy, probably college student making extra cash, walked into the lobby with a stack of certified envelopes, handed them to reception, got signatures, walked out. Simple, clean, professional. Inside those envelopes was a mirror nobody wanted to look at. I finished my coffee. Black, still too hot, but I drank it anyway. Then I drove to the marina. 2 hours later, Trevor would walk into the biggest meeting of his career. Malcolm Pierce would be sitting there with my letter, and reality would catch up with 18 months of incompetence dressed up as innovation. I didn't need to be there for that. The systems would speak for themselves. The boardroom was all glass and hubris. 27th floor. Panoramic view of the bay. One of those conference tables that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about disruptive thinking. You can always tell when a company's in trouble. The nicer the conference room, the worse the fundamentals. Trevor was dressed for coronation. Navy blazer, crisp white shirt, hair product that probably cost more than my truck payment. He had his presentation loaded, talking points memorized, that Stanford confidence that comes from never actually failing at anything that mattered. Malcolm Pierce sat at the head of the table, 55 years old, 3 recessions under his belt, 0 tolerance for bullshit. The kind of investor who'd made his fortune by knowing the difference between pitch decks and actual businesses. He had my letter open in front of him. Certified mail delivered 2 hours ago. He'd read it twice, according to what he told me later. Once to make sure he understood it. Once to confirm he wasn't misreading it. Trevor clicked his remote. First slide appeared. Thank you for joining us today. At Apex, we don't just build platforms. We architect trust. That line made Malcolm's eyebrow go up, just slightly. For investors like Malcolm, that's the equivalent of standing up and screaming. The presentation rolled on. Hockey stick growth projections. Pie charts about market expansion. Buzzwords stacked like a house of cards. Scalable empathy. Culture-forward architecture. Operational synergy. No mention of product stability. No mention of back-end infrastructure. No mention that the systems running their entire platform were built by a guy they'd fired 3 weeks ago with a misspelled hoodie. Trevor clicked to a slide titled The Next Chapter. We've positioned ourselves to triple ARR in the next 18 months through strategic partnerships and proprietary system leverage. Malcolm held up a hand. Trevor stopped mid-sentence, blinked. The room went quiet. Before we go further, Malcolm said, voice calm as a surgeon, can we clarify something? He picked up my letter, held it like evidence in a trial. This document states that Garrett Holloway was terminated 3 weeks ago for cultural misalignment. Malcolm looked at Trevor, then at Richard Ashford. Was this termination reviewed by legal counsel? Trevor's mouth opened. Closed, yes. HR handled the process. It was a culture fit issue. Culture fit. Malcolm didn't blink. Did you have documentation? Performance reviews? Formal cause. It was a leadership decision based on what? Malcolm's tone could freeze water. Because according to this letter, you terminated your VP of operations without cause, without documentation, and without due process. He placed the letter on the table, slid it toward the center where everyone could see it. And in doing so, you triggered Clause 12, 7B of your vendor licensing agreement with Holloway Integrated Solutions. Silence, the kind where you can hear the air conditioning working overtime. Trevor looked confused. I'm not familiar with, you should be. Malcolm opened his due diligence folder, pulled out another document. This clause makes your entire back-end infrastructure contingent on Mr. Holloway's continued employment. Richard Ashford, Trevor's father, the CEO, went pale, started to say something, stopped. Malcolm continued. When you terminated him without cause, you didn't just fire an employee. You terminated your license to your own product. The general counsel stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the glass wall. He grabbed the document from Malcolm's hand, started reading. His face went from confused to horrified in about 5 seconds. How did we sign this? Your department approved it during vendor consolidation 18 months ago, Malcolm said. It's filed under routine vendor agreements. Every signature authenticated. Every filing current with the state. Trevor found his voice. This is just a technicality. We can negotiate with his attorney. This is ownership, Malcolm cut in. Sharp now. Without this license, you have no legal right to operate the systems you're pitching. Every integration, every API, every data pipeline built on infrastructure you no longer own. He pointed at the presentation screen where Trevor's slides still glowed. This roadmap assumes platform stability, operational capacity. You have neither. Malcolm closed his folder. What you have is an illegal deployment of software tied to a revoked license. You're showing me vaporware. The vice president of sales stood up, walked to the window, looked like he was considering whether jumping was a viable exit strategy. The CTO buried his face in his hands. The CFO just stared at the ceiling like maybe God would explain how this happened. Trevor turned to his father. We can fix this. There has to be a way to... With what? Richard Ashford's voice came out strangled. He clutched his chest. Actually clutched it. Like the weight of his son's incompetence had physical mass. The room erupted. Voices overlapping. Someone threw a pen. The general counsel was flipping through contract binders, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. Malcolm stood up, collected his papers. Gentlemen, you just killed your own company. He walked to the door, paused, looked around the room. $50 million. That's what this round was worth. His voice was quiet, conversational. The way you talk about weather, you lost it because you thought experience was expensive. He left, took the money with him. The door closed with a soft click. Nobody moved. Then Trevor spun toward his father. Call his attorney. Offer him whatever he wants. We need that license back. And pay him with what? Richard's face had gone gray, sweat beading on his forehead. We just lost our Series B. We have 6 months of runway. Maybe. Then we'll what? Richard stood up, swayed slightly, put his hand on the table to steady himself. You fired the one person who understood how this company actually works. You did it in front of everyone. You did it without checking a single contract. His voice cracked. You did exactly what I was afraid you'd do. And now we're done. Trevor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Richard Ashford clutched his chest again. Tighter this time. His breathing got shallow. Dad? Richard didn't answer. Just slid back into his chair, face pale, hand pressed against his sternum. Someone yelled for security to call 911. The CFO started doing chest compressions. The room dissolved into chaos. And somewhere across the bay, I was on my sailboat, sanding teak, with no idea any of this was happening yet. Doug called at noon. You're not going to believe this. I set down my sandpaper. Try me. Malcolm Pierce walked out of their pitch after 15 minutes. Took the entire $50 million off the table. Good, Gary, it gets better. Richard Ashford had a heart attack during the board meeting. They took him to Stanford Medical. He's stable, but he's stepping down as CEO. Effective immediately. I took a sip of bourbon, looked at the water. And Trevor? Fired. Board voted unanimously an hour ago. They're bringing in a crisis management firm. Huh? Doug laughed. That's all you have to say? You just collapsed a company in one morning. I didn't collapse anything, I said. Trevor collapsed it. I just removed the scaffolding he didn't know was holding everything up. There's a difference? Big one. I built systems that worked. They fired me without reading the contract. That's not revenge. That's consequences. Doug was quiet for a moment. They want to talk. About what? Buying back the license. Board seat, 7 figures. Plus they want you to come back as COO. I looked at my boat. The teak that still needed sanding. The rigging that needed maintenance. The harbor that didn't care about quarterly earnings or venture capital, or sons who thought a last name was the same as competence. Tell them I'll think about it. Gary, tell them I'm busy. Doing what? Maintenance. Doug laughed again. You earned this. No, I said. I built it. There's a difference. I hung up, sat on my boat, watched the water move without permission, without meetings or slide decks or MBAs explaining why it should flow differently. And for the first time in 28 years, I didn't check my work email. Because unlike Apex Systems, this boat was mine. Fully owned, no clauses required. 3 days later, the calls started. First was the crisis management firm. Professional, polite. Asked if I'd be willing to consult on operational continuity during a transition period. I told them no. Then came the board members, one by one, each with a slightly different pitch, each trying to sound like they'd been on my side all along. I told them all the same thing. I'm not interested. Then Alan Brewster called again. The outside counsel who'd tried the informal conversation approach. Mr. Holloway, the board has authorized me to make a formal offer. I was replacing a halyard on my boat, 40 feet of line that needed splicing, the kind of work that requires attention and patience. I'm listening, I said. $750,000 for a 5-year license renewal, plus a board seat with full voting rights, plus a consulting contract at your previous salary for the next 12 months. I kept working on the splice. What happened to Trevor? Terminated. Severance package contingent on a non-disparagement agreement. And Richard, medical leave. Indefinite. The board is conducting a search for interim CEO. I finished the splice. Tested the tension. Good. Tell the board I'll think about it. Mr. Holloway, with respect, they need an answer soon. Without the license, the company has maybe 6 months before. I know what they have, I said. I built it. That's why I know exactly how long it'll last without me. Silence on the other end. I'll think about it, I repeated. Have a good day, Alan. I hung up. Doug called 10 minutes later. You're torturing them. I'm doing maintenance on my boat. Gary, $750 is a good offer. Board seat gives you control. Consulting contract is basically free money. I know, so why haven't you said yes? I looked at the harbor, boats rocking gently in their slips. Seagulls doing their thing, water that didn't care about licensing agreements or board seats or Nepo babies learning expensive lessons. Because I'm 53 years old, I said. I spent 28 years building systems for people who didn't appreciate them, who took credit for them, who fired me with a misspelled hoodie because some kid with an MBA convinced his father I was obsolete, and now you're making them pay. Number. Now I'm deciding if I want to go back. Doug was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about the Carl Vinson. Remember when we had that radar failure during the storm? Captain was panicking. Everyone running around like the ship was sinking. You fixed it in 20 minutes. 30. And you know what I learned? Systems fail when people don't maintain them. When they think everything runs by magic. When they hire people who look good in meetings but can't actually do the work. Apex is that radar system. Exactly, and I can fix it. Question is whether I want to. What's the answer? I looked at my boat, 40 years old. Built in 1985, still solid because someone had maintained it properly. Still floating because the fundamentals were sound. I'll let you know, I said. That evening, Malcolm Pierce called. Not through his assistant. Direct line, Mr. Holloway, Malcolm Pierce. We met briefly at the Apex pitch. I remember I'd like to buy you dinner. Tonight, if you're available. I'm available. Good. There's a steakhouse in Palo Alto. Morton's, 7 o'clock? I'll be there. Morton's at 7 p.m. Malcolm was already seated. Bourbon in front of him. He stood when I arrived. Firm handshake. The kind that says I respect you without trying too hard. We sat, ordered steaks. Talked about nothing important until the food arrived. Then Malcolm got to it. I've been an investor for 30 years, he said. I've seen companies fail for every reason you can imagine. Bad product, bad timing, bad market, bad luck. He cut his steak. But this is the first time I've seen a company kill itself by firing the person who built it. Trevor had help. Trevor's an idiot. But Richard let him be an idiot. That's worse. Malcolm took a bite. I read your contract. All of it, including the clause. And it's brilliant. Legally airtight. Ethically justified. And operationally devastating. He looked at me. You spent 6 years building insurance nobody noticed. The Navy teaches you to plan for failure. Most people plan to prevent it. You plan to survive it. Same thing, Malcolm smiled. Not even close. He sipped his bourbon. The board wants you back. You know that, Doug told me. Are you going to do it? I cut my steak. Took a bite. Good meat. Cooked right. What do you think I should do? I think you should negotiate. Malcolm leaned back. They're offering $750 for the license. That's insultingly low. The company's worth 8 figures on paper. Without your infrastructure, it's worth nothing. You should ask for $2 million. Plus equity. Plus the board seat with veto rights on operational decisions. That's a lot. That's what you're worth. They just learned it the expensive way. And if they say no, Malcolm shrugged. Then in 6 months, when they're out of money and can't operate, you buy the company for pennies on the dollar. Keep what works. Sell what doesn't. Retire on the proceeds. You've thought about this. I think about everything. It's why I still have money. He finished his bourbon. But here's what I really think. You don't want to go back. That surprised me. Why do you say that? Because men like you don't build fail-safes for fun. You built that clause because you knew this was coming. You knew Trevor was incompetent. You knew Richard was weak. You knew the company was rotten. Malcolm signaled for another bourbon. And you walked away clean. No lawsuit, no arbitration. No, he said, she said. Just consequences wrapped in legal language. So men who plan exits that clean don't usually come back through the entrance. I thought about that. Thought about the boat, the harbor, the teak that still needed work. What would you do? I asked. Malcolm smiled. I'd take the money, keep the board seat, but I wouldn't go back to work. I'd hire someone I trusted to run operations. I'd collect my consulting fee for doing nothing. And I'd spend my time doing whatever the hell I wanted. That's your advice? That's what I'd do if I were you, and I'd already won. We finished our steaks. Talked about sailing, about the Navy, about the difference between people who build things and people who take credit for them. When we left, Malcolm shook my hand again. Whatever you decide, you earned it. Thanks for dinner. Thank you for the lesson. I needed reminding that due diligence matters. I drove back to the marina, sat on my boat, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, thought about Malcolm's words, about Doug's advice, about the board's offer, about Trevor learning that a last name isn't the same as competence, about Richard learning that protecting your son doesn't mean enabling his incompetence, about 28 years of building systems for people who thought they were magic. The next morning I called Doug. Counter offer, I said. $2 million for a perpetual license, 20% equity, board seat with veto rights on C-suite hires and operational decisions, consulting contract for 12 months at my old salary, but I work remotely. No office requirement. Doug whistled. That's aggressive. That's what I'm worth. If they say no, I'll wait 6 months and buy the company when they run out of money. You'd do that? Malcolm Pierce thinks I should. And he's been right about everything else so far. Doug laughed. I'll draft it this afternoon. Give them 48 hours to respond. Thanks, Doug. Gary, you really going to go back? I looked at my boat, at the work that still needed doing, at the water that kept moving regardless of contracts or board meetings or Nepo babies. Maybe, I said, but on my terms this time. They accepted in 36 hours. $2 million, 20% equity, board seat with veto rights, remote work, everything. The press release went out a week later. Apex Systems welcomes back Garrett Holloway as senior advisor and board member. Trevor's termination was buried in paragraph 7. Following a strategic restructuring, Richard's medical leave was paragraph 8, to focus on health and family. I didn't do any interviews, didn't post on LinkedIn, didn't make any statements, just took the money, signed the papers, set up my remote office on my boat. Because here's what I learned in the Navy, and what Trevor never understood. The best systems are the ones that work whether you're there or not. The best revenge isn't destroying someone. It's building something they can't replace, protecting it with language they don't bother to read, and letting their own incompetence do the rest. Trevor thought firing me would clear the path for his vision. Instead, it activated a clause he didn't know existed, and taught him an expensive lesson about the difference between having a title and earning one. 6 months later, I was on my boat, bourbon on the console, sun setting over the harbor. Rigging clinking in the breeze. My phone buzzed. Email notification. Subject line. Apex Systems acquired by Tech Venture Capital. $47 million. Opened it. Skimmed the details. The company I'd helped rebuild had just been sold. My 20% equity was worth $9.5 million. I set the phone down, picked up my bourbon, Raised it to the empty harbor. Here's to legacy thinking, I said to nobody. Then I finished my drink and went back to work on the teak. Because unlike quarterly earnings or venture capital or sons who thought PowerPoints were the same as competence, this boat was real. It would float as long as I maintained it. And nobody could fire me from my own deck. The water didn't care about board meetings. The wind didn't care about pitch decks. And after 30 years of building systems for other people, I'd finally built one that was mine. Fully owned, no clauses required. Just patience, planning, and the understanding that sometimes the quietest move is the one that echoes the loudest. Trevor learned that lesson the hard way. I learned it in the Navy. And now, on a 40-foot sailboat in a California harbor, I was finally putting it to use for myself. The sunset was perfect. The bourbon was smooth. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't building anything for anyone but me. That's not revenge. That's freedom.